Between 1898 and 1994, the United States successfully overthrew 41 governments in Latin America alone. That's one regime change every 28 months for an entire century. And that's just one hemisphere. Washington calls it defending freedom. The families of 200,000 dead Guatemalans, 30,000 tortured Chileans, 50,000 Nicaraguan Civil War casualties, they call it something else entirely. This isn't about isolated incidents. This is systematic doctrine spanning 75 years, 8 presidential administrations from both parties, operations on 5 continents. Let's trace how overthrowing governments became standard American foreign policy and why it keeps failing whilst continuing anyway. Picture August 1953, Tehran. CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt coordinates mobs, bribes military officers, orchestrates propaganda, all whilst Eisenhower maintains plausible deniability, participating in no meetings, leaving no documents. He controlled the operation through oral reports from Secretary of State Foster Dulles, never implicating himself directly. The convergence that justified Operation Ajax reveals the pattern we'll see repeated for decades. British oil interests losing nationalised Anglo-Iranian oil company assets. American Cold War fears that communism might fill power vacuums, strategic resources at stake. Iran controlled access to roughly 50% of the world's oil reserves. American officials articulated a collapse narrative in early 1953. Iran's political instability might deteriorate into state collapse, through which communist influence would expand. The mechanism? Psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns painting Prime Minister Mosaddegh as a communist pawn, military coordination, bribed mobs. The operation cost $60,000, succeeded in days. The consequences? Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi ruled as a US-backed authoritarian for 26 years. Savak secret police tortured thousands. When the 1979 revolution erupted, it explicitly targeted American-backed dictatorship. Ayatollah Khomeini identified the West and mainly the US as the prominent rival of the Islamic Republic. American diplomats held hostage 444 days. US-Iran relations poisoned for 45+ years and counting. But here's what matters. Eisenhower concluded this should become standard doctrine. Covert action worked in removing leaders, cost less than military invasion, maintained deniability. Guatemala 1954 proved the template could be replicated. CIA orchestrated Operation PB Success against democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz. His crime? Land reform. Decree 900 redistributed unused estates to landless peasants. United Fruit Company lost holdings, lobbied Washington. CIA framed the operation as removing a communist-controlled government. Eisenhower's actual view, now declassified, democracy in Guatemala is premature. Clandestine operations are an inexpensive alternative to military intervention. The operation cost $3 million. Psychological warfare proved more effective than actual military force. Aerial bombing caused little material damage but convinced citizens the insurgency was overwhelming. Arbenz overthrown within weeks. Military junta installed. United Fruit holdings protected. CIA concluded the template worked, emboldening the US to use similar tactics in future interventions, ranging from covert actions to full-scale invasions. Then came the consequences. 1960 to 1996 Guatemalan Civil War. 200,000 deaths, mostly indigenous civilians. Mayan Ixil population subjected to genocide in the early 1980s, with US backing for Guatemalan military, despite knowledge of atrocities. The $3 million operation produced consequences still being counted 7 decades later. Iran and Guatemala weren't aberrations, they were prototypes. Over the next 40 years, this template would be applied dozens of times. George Kennan articulated long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies in 1947. He conceptualized this as primarily defensive, non-military, political-economic strategy. The Soviet Union sought to aid and inspire revolutionary movements around the world through relatively inexpensive means. America should counter through strengthening Allied institutions, economic development, demonstrating capitalist success. Kennan later assessed, the Soviets did not need to be deterred militarily. Containment was never supposed to mean military intervention against every leftist movement globally, but the Korean War catalyzed a shift. Limited communist expansion in one peninsula became the template for viewing all leftist movements as Soviet proxies requiring military response. The domino theory crystallized. If one country falls to communism, neighboring states will follow. Therefore, any leftist government anywhere represents strategic defeat requiring prevention. Anti-communism became all-purpose justification. Guatemala's land reform equals communist takeover. Chile's democratic socialist equals Soviet expansion. Nicaragua's Sandinistas equal communist beachhead. Actual Moscow involvement became irrelevant. Ideology alone justified intervention. Here's the gap between rhetoric and reality. American officials consistently expressed democratic preferences, framed interventions as defending freedom. Yet the United States ordered interventions to overthrow elected governments more often than to restore democracy in Latin America. Eisenhower viewed Guatemalan democracy as premature. Nixon ordered CIA to make the economy scream against Chile's elected president. In more than 55% of Cold War covert regime change missions, the targeted states experienced government-sponsored mass killing episodes within 10 years of the attempt. Statistical analysis shows the most common outcome of a foreign regime change operation is democracy reduction in the territory. You wanted to stop communism? Fair enough. But when your operation systematically produced torture states, civil wars and mass killings, the very horrors you claim to be preventing, something's gone catastrophically wrong with the doctrine. The Iran oil calculation reveals what often accompanied ideological justifications. Iran held access to roughly 50% of world oil reserves in 1953 context. Nationalization of Anglo-Iranian Oil Company threatened Western corporate control. British intelligence pushed America to intervene after Mossadi nationalized the oil industry. Declassified CIA assessment, preventing collapse by stabilizing Iran's political system and resuming the flow of oil, thereby solving the government's financial problems and ensuring a stable source of revenue for Iran's economic development, was the primary motivation for Operation TP Ajax. The mechanism? Economic strangulation first. By September 1951, Iran's oil exports had been reduced to zero through Anglo-Iranian coordination with international petroleum companies. Economic pressure created conditions where Mossadegh would either need to take full control over Iran's state and economy or lean on outside support, then coup whilst he's weakened. Guatemala involved similar entanglement. United Fruit Company controlled vast unused estates. Arbenz' Decree 900 redistributed idle land to landless peasants. United Fruit actively lobbied Eisenhower administration, framed land reform as communist threat. The coup was justified by claims of countering communism, but it largely served US economic interests. Here's the complexity scholars document. Capitalism was not at risk in the overwhelming majority of US interventions, perhaps even in none of them. Economic interests alone don't explain the pattern, but here's what economics does explain: post-intervention trade patterns. CIA covert regime change operations during the Cold War caused an increase in American imports to the local territory in industries where the United States had a comparative disadvantage, meaning American firms used this new influence to sell non-competitive goods in the market. The structural outcome? Post-coup Guatemala shows deepening structural inequalities, entrenched social inequality, corruption, and persistent economic dependency. Regime change created dependent economies serving external interests rather than mutual benefit. Chile's Track 2 demonstrates covert action at maximum ambition. Nixon's directive, make the economy scream. CIA ordered to destabilize through economic sabotage whilst maintaining cover. The operational detail, now declassified, CIA task force headed by David Atlee Phillips, team of covert operatives inserted individually into Chile, contacts with military attachés, provision of sterile weapons for kidnapping anti-coup officers. Operations be conducted so as to hide the American hand, and the CIA is to ignore any orders to the contrary from Ambassador Corrie, who has not been informed of Track 2 operations. September 11, 1973, military coup succeeds. Whether CIA directly triggered it remains disputed, but Kissinger's orders prove unambiguous. It is firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown by a coup. The success rate? Covert operations succeeded in replacing the leader in power only 39% of the time during the Cold War. Even when successful short-term, consequences often catastrophic. Contemporary Venezuela sanctions demonstrate how mechanisms evolved. Trump administration expanded sanctions targeting Venezuelan oil exports, implementing efforts to enforce a quasi-blockade of sanctioned oil tankers. Secondary sanctions threaten any country selling oil to target regimes with tariffs and penalties, extraterritorial enforcement. The civilian harm: sanctions produce medicine shortages, food scarcity, unemployment, humanitarian crises. Yet policymakers characterize suffering as necessary pressure, forcing regime change. Then came Operation Absolute Resolve in January 2026, the most significant US direct action operation in Latin America since Panama in 1989. Delta Force raid captured President Maduro from Caracas residence at 2 a.m. The sophistication: 5 months of CIA clandestine ground team intelligence collection, coordination of stealth aircraft, electronic warfare, cyber operations, direct action forces, demonstrates American capability to execute precision decapitation strikes globally. From $60,000 covert operations to multi-billion-dollar invasions, the mechanisms evolved, but the logic persisted. Statistical documentation proves overwhelming. In roughly 40% of cases of covert regime change undertaken during the Cold War, a civil war occurred within 10 years of the operation. In more than 55% of cases of covert regime change missions undertaken during the Cold War, the targeted states experienced a government-sponsored mass killing episode within 10 years of the regime change attempt. The most common outcome of a foreign regime change operation is democracy reduction in the territory. Operations succeed in removing leaders, but systematically fail to achieve stated objectives of democracy, stability, prosperity. Guatemala exemplifies the consequence cascade. Following the 1954 coup, civil war lasted 1960 to 1996, 36 years, 200,000 deaths, mostly indigenous civilians, Mayan Ixil population subjected to genocide in early 1980s, US backing for the Guatemalan military despite knowledge of human rights abuses. Today, poverty and malnutrition widespread, worsened by climate change, which has ravaged the agricultural sector. Generations of Guatemalans never knowing democracy or prosperity. Cost-benefit: $3 million CIA operation in 1954. 7 decades of consequences still accumulating. Chile, Pinochet military junta seized power September 11, 1973. Approximately 3,000 killed, over 30,000 tortured, thousands disappeared. National Stadium became detention and torture center. Operation Condor coordinated Southern Cone intelligence operations, kidnapping, torture, assassination across borders. American officials knew, tacitly approved, sometimes coordinated. Iran, the Shah's 26-year rule featured SAVAK secret police torturing political opponents. Amnesty International documented systematic human rights abuses. US continued support. When revolution erupted in 1979, it explicitly targeted American-backed dictatorship. The revolution's anti-American character: direct retaliation for American backing of the Shah. November 1979, revolutionary students seized US embassy, held 52 Americans hostage 444 days, the 45-plus-year consequence. US-Iran relations poisoned for nearly half a century. Iran became Central American adversary in Middle East. Nicaragua, decade of Contra war, tens of thousands dead, billions spent. The outcome? 1990 elections removed Sandinistas through democratic process, not Contra victory. Sandinistas returned to power through elections in 2006. Decade of war accomplished nothing permanent. Iraq, 2003 invasion aftermath saw state institutions dismantled. Sectarian civil war ignited 2004 to 2008. Hundreds of thousands killed. ISIS emerged from the ruins in 2014. 20-plus years later, functioning state still not fully restored. Stated objectives: WMD elimination, terrorism reduction, democracy promotion all failed. Actual outcome: Iranian influence expansion, regional destabilization, jihadist movements strengthened. Policymakers commonly blame the failures on botched execution, rather than questioning the fundamental soundness of regime change as a strategy. Bay of Pigs failed because invasion force too small, not because overthrowing Castro was unachievable. Iraq failed because de-Baathification too extensive, not because invasion itself was misconceived. Each failure attributed to specific tactical errors. Pattern across dozens of interventions never forces reconsideration of strategy itself. Elliot Abrams articulates this logic regarding Venezuela 2026. refusing to act would signal there are hostile nations in the whole Western Hemisphere that America tolerates. His assessment? If there is an escalation, by hitting Venezuelan targets and using covert action to press for a change in government, I think the odds are 75-25 that Maduro will be out. Confidence in military pressure's efficacy persists despite contrary historical evidence. The Trump administration's Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine commits to establishing conditions so that there are no hostile nations in the whole Western Hemisphere. Unambiguous sphere of influence doctrine, this abandons pretense that interventions serve universal democratic principles, explicitly asserts geopolitical dominance as sufficient justification. Russia lost a key outpost in the Americas through Maduro's capture, yet Russian analysts recognize American regime change operations, validate Russian sphere of influence claims. From Russia's perspective, a US embrace of a world order framed around spheres of influence would probably be a best-case scenario. The Primakov Doctrine, US meddling in Russia's near abroad, is to be responded to by a reciprocal Russian presence in Latin America and the Caribbean. If America can regime change Venezuela, Russia can regime change Ukraine. China's foreign ministry condemned Operation Absolute Resolve as in clear violation of international law, basic norms in international relations, and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Brazil condemned American action as flagrant violation of the UN Charter and fundamental principles of international law. Pledged to pursue the matter in UN Security Council, OAS, CELAC. Mexico, Colombia, Cuba, Nicaragua issued forceful condemnations, characterizing the operation as dangerous precedent of gunboat diplomacy that destabilizes the entire region. 75 years, dozens of interventions, statistical evidence overwhelming, 40% produce civil wars, 55% produce mass killings, majority produce democracy reduction rather than improvement. American officials claim democracy promotion. Evidence shows regime change operations systematically reduce democracy. Rhetoric and reality persistently diverge. Each intervention delegitimizes American claims to principled foreign policy. Russian, Chinese, Iranian officials cite American regime changes to justify their own violations. UN General Assembly votes 165-7 against American embargo tactics. Operation Absolute Resolve proved American capability to execute sophisticated military operations globally, also proved American willingness to violate international law when officials deem necessary. What this reveals? Regime change represents not rational strategy serving clear interests, but institutionalized practice serving bureaucratic, ideological and political functions regardless of outcomes. Pattern persists because it serves domestic political needs, demonstrating resolve, appearing strong. Serves bureaucratic needs, justifying capabilities and budgets. Serves ideological needs, affirming American exceptionalism. These functions matter more than strategic objectives or empirical evidence. Trump administration considers operations against Iran, Nicaragua, potentially others. Academic evidence predicting failure will be ignored. Justifications will emphasize current threat whilst minimizing historical pattern. Operations will likely proceed. Consequences will accumulate over decades. Next generation of policymakers will pursue regime change anyway, convinced this time will be different. It's 2026. 73 years since Iran. 72 since Guatemala. 23 since Iraq. 41 governments overthrown in Latin America alone, one every 28 months for a century. The evidence is overwhelming. The doctrine persists. The consequences continue to accumulate, and the next intervention is likely already being planned. This is the story that doesn't fit YouTube's optimization model. Deep historical analysis instead of hot takes. Declassified documents instead of speculation. If you made it this far, the like button tells the algorithm someone values substantive analysis. Subscribe because the pattern continues. Academic research will document failure